Hello there, my friends. It is Kendra, and welcome back to my first video here in some time. Today we are going to be spending a whole day with my sourdough starter here, and you're gonna see what I make with it. I am getting it out of the fridge where it tends to live, and just feeding it here this evening because I wanted to prepare something with it the next day. So first step in sourdough is feed your starter. So that is what I am doing here. I kind of just eyeball it. I know when I first started doing sourdough, everything was like 100 grams flour, 100 grams water, or like the exact same amount. I just eyeball it. And in the summertime tends to be a little bit more runnier, and in the wintertime it's a bit more gloopier and thicker. So it all depends on your environment, how you like your sourdough, but that's just what I do. So I feed my starter until it's looking about right, and then I cleaned up and let it just rest and hang out for the night. So it is the next morning, well, almost afternoon here, as you can see by the timestamp, but I am just getting all of my supplies out, ready to start making my doughs. So today I am making first just my sourdough sandwich loaf. This is my standard loaf that it's the main thing that I do with my starter. And then I'm also going to be making some bagels. And both of the recipes and most of everything that I've learned from sourdough, I have learned from Sarah Therese. She has a YouTube channel, she has a website with recipes, all sorts of things, so I will link that below. So if you want to try these recipes for yourself, then you can do so. But here I'm just putting in all of my ingredients into my mixing bowl. I do most everything by weight. When it comes to sourdough, it tends to be the easiest, and then I also have less dishes and I'm not constantly cleaning little measuring cups and spoons and things like that. So this is just how it works well for me, and you can find what works best for you. So now that I have all of my ingredients in my bowl, I snap it into my KitchenAid mixer. I use the dough hook, and then I typically put this on, well, the dough hook says to use it at max speed of 2. For bread dough, I normally mix it around like a 1/2 to a 1 speed, maybe 2. Typically it's on 1 though, for any kind of thick dough, and I just let that stir and let it mix until everything is really well combined. And then I'm just going to take the dough hook off using some wet fingers. Wet fingers is going to help prevent the dough from sticking to you, because this is actually a pretty wet and sticky dough. So I always use very wet hands when I'm handling this dough. That's why I don't even take the hook out of the dough until I've wet down my hands, because otherwise it's just going to create a sticky mess on you, and nobody wants that. So like I had said, now I've got my really nice and wet hand, I slide off any remaining dough, excuse the truck in the background, any remaining dough off of the hook and plop that back into the bowl, and then I'm just kind of scraping the sides, getting it all into a neat little pile, getting a really warm water to wet down just a flour sack towel, and that's gonna live over my dough, and I'm just gonna leave it to rise. And then the next thing I'm doing is creating my dough for my bagels. Now what I did here is I just used Sarah Teresa's recipe for her blueberry bagels and just omitted the blueberries. I didn't have any dehydrated blueberries on hand. I have made the blueberry recipe or the blueberry bagel recipe in the past, and it is absolutely delicious, but I find even if you omit the blueberries, it's still an absolutely delicious recipe just as plain bagels. So I have made that here today, and I also in the future want to try making some like brown sugar and cinnamon bagels. Wouldn't that be so delicious? I don't know. I also was a bit worried because I almost ran out of my starter here, and that's all I've got. That's literally all I have left. But I just added lots more flour and fed it really well, and she's good to go again. Then adding in some vanilla. These makes these bagels just like slightly sweet even when they're plain, and I think that's why they're so delicious. The other amazing thing about this recipe, and I'm sure if you've noticed the container that I'm putting everything in, is that you can make this dough in a bread machine. And I have the KBS bread machine, and I put it on, I believe it's level 12, which is just leavening the dough, which is amazing. All you have to do is put the ingredients in, throw it in your bread maker, select the right thing. It's going to turn and like mix your dough for you, and then it's also going to heat up, let it rise a little bit, knead it, which is so amazing because then this is a whole hour and a half of time that I can have while my bread is doing its thing. And you can see it's mixing it all in there, and it turns into this like little dough ball that just like spins around, hangs out in there, and then when I get it out later, it's going to be nice and slightly risen and puffy and just beautiful and delicious. So next we are moving on, and we are just feeding our starter. Like I had told you earlier, I had almost none of my starter left, and so I'm putting a really good amount of flour in there, feeding it with my warm water and mixing it all up and just letting it hang out on my counter. When I'm making bread dough, my sourdough starter hangs out on my counter, and when I am done making bread dough, my sourdough starter goes into my fridge until I'm ready to pull it out. And like you saw in the beginning of this video, I normally pull it out the night before I want to make something and feed it. So that's how I do my starter. If you're new to sourdough, it's not as intimidating as it may seem. It's just, you know, trial and error, and you have to be okay with the fact that you're probably gonna mess up the first few times, because I know I definitely did. But then once you get into this realm where you start making wonderful, delicious homemade goodies, it's gonna be addicting. You're not gonna want to stop, girl. Like, oh, it's so much fun. So much fun. I love how earlier when I was refilling my flowers that I put the bags in the containers, because I do that to like avoid flour spilling everywhere, and look at me here, just cleaning up flour anyway. So I always tend to make a mess when I'm making bread, and I'm also you know, just like rolling dough on my counter and stuff, so it gets messy. And honestly, when I'm washing my hands constantly, like I just like sprinkle and flick water on the counter like that, because I'm too lazy and my hands are all wet, and I don't want to reach down in the cupboard below to grab up my cleaner and then get the bottle all wet, and it's just easier to just like flick water on the counter. Anyway, now it is a little bit later and our dough has risen in the bread maker. It is all poofy and cute and delicious. So we are taking it back over to the counter, and the instructions on the recipe were to, once it's done in the bread maker, get it out, put it on your counter. Don't flour your counter surface, don't get it wet, don't do anything. Just get your dough all out, knead it a little bit, and then let it sit for another half hour under a damp towel. So that's what I did. These bagels are a little bit more hands-on, where there's steps where you have to do it like wait 30 minutes, do something again, wait 30 minutes, do something again, wait an hour, do something again, you know. So it's one of those things where you have to be home, and that's the whole thing with sourdough, is you have to be home, or you have to be where your starter, where your dough is, in order to work with it. Sorry, there's been loud planes here all day, if you can hear that. We even had jets flying over our house earlier today. So anyway, I let the bagel dough just sit on the counter, and then I'm also doing my first set of stretch and folds with my bread dough, my sandwich loaf dough. So this dough is very forgiving. I find I can do 2 to 3 stretch and folds, or I can do like 5 or 6 stretch and folds, and my bread comes out delicious either way. So it's really all about the starter and just giving it time. That is the hardest part about sourdough, is having the patience to wait for the bread, because it's so good in the end, but you have to wait for the bread. So anyway, like I had said, how these doughs are a little bit more like labor intensive, in that like you have to do something to it every few hours or 30 minutes, whatever. It was a little bit later, and so I am kneading that bagel dough again, and then I am just going to let it sit on the counter underneath that damp towel and let it rest until it's ready to shape. Now that my dough has sat, it is ready to shape, but the first thing I need to do is to cut it into equal parts. Now, they're not perfectly equal, and you can tell in the end that some of them were a little bit bigger and more poofy than others, but cutting that dough into, I made 8 this time. I think next time I can probably stretch it to about 10. But that is just what I am doing. I'm cutting the dough into like equal parts, and then I'm just making them into these little dough balls just by like tucking the ends onto itself, and then kind of using my hands and pulling that dough ball backwards. And that motion, that little bit of friction that it has on the counter, creates some pull to it, and that creates that smooth, nice round surface of the top of the bun or the top of the bagel or the top of the loaf, whatever kind of bread that you're making with your sourdough. That's what makes that nice smooth top. And then once you let the dough balls rise, then they poof up and they just get more voluptuous, and they get all those yummy, tasty, fluffy air bubbles in them, which makes your dough so delicious and so like soft, chewy, and yummy to eat. And also those little air pockets are what soaks up all that delicious butter in the end. So now that our little dough balls have risen, now comes the funnest part, and that is shaping them into the bagels. You literally just like poke your finger or your thumb through the center of the bagel and just kind of use your other finger and make a circular motion, kind of twist it around, and there you have your bagel shape. Now, I probably could have made these holes a lot bigger. I honestly thought they were pretty big to start out with, and then you'll see in the end all of my bagels literally just look like they have little buttholes on them, because all of them closed up and none of them actually had holes in them. So you can make your bagel holes quite large. And I'm just gonna stop now before I say anything too inappropriate. So now it was time for my next stretch and fold. I, again, don't do this by like a precise amount of time. I normally just wait until the dough looks like it has doubled in size, or just whenever I can get to it. Sometimes I will go 1 hour between a stretch and fold. Sometimes it gets away from me and I go 3. So it all just depends. And also I feel like the first waiting period between when you first make the dough and the first stretch and fold, I feel like that typically takes the longest, because it takes that yeast time to really start activating and bubbling up, but once it's started, then it keeps going. So that has been my experience in the past. Next then, I am boiling my bagels and putting down some cornmeal first on the parchment paper before I bake them. Apparently, according to Sarah Therese, boiling the bagels in this like brown sugar bath, it helps create that like bagel crust and creates the chewiness that makes bagels so great, and they've come out delicious every time I've made this recipe. So you really just boil the bagels for about 30 seconds each side. I'm just using this like wooden spatula thing that I have with the slots in it, so that way I'm not getting water everywhere. But then once they've boiled on each side, you put them on the parchment that I personally like to line with cornmeal. For my bagels, same with my English muffins, I put cornmeal on those too, and then they are going to be baked. And now was finally the time to pull my bagels out of the oven, and they look and smell delicious. I'll also insert a picture, but there's definitely no holes in those bagels, so enjoy at your own risk. Okay, next it was time to shape my sandwich loaf, and the next thing that I'm doing here is folding and cutting my parchment. This, once I discovered this, is amazing. It's so great. You just line up your pan, you cut little slits to like the width of the pan. Hello, Zeke. My dog is here. You want to say hello? Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you for kisses. Anyway, you cut the parchment on each end and then you fold it to fit the shape of the pan. I hope that makes sense. Obviously you can see what I'm doing here as well. And then you just neatly fold in the parchment paper to fit and line your loaf pan. I find it works best to fold in the center middle piece and then the two sides, so that way it's just the easiest when taking the loaf off when it's really hot and you don't want to touch it. I then folded down the sides of the parchment just so that it's easier when I go to rest the damp towel on, and then I am finally pulling out my bubbly beautiful starter with my wet hands. I'm also sprinkling the counter here a little bit too, but pulling out my starter using a hard plastic scraper to scrape the sides, because like I said earlier, this dough is very wet and very sticky, and this also I feel like creates that like chewiness and I don't know, that softness in the bread because it's so moist. But anyway, using my wet hands, I kind of poke some little holes in the bread with my fingers and then fold it in on itself, tuck all the ends in, and then, like I said earlier, with my bagel balls, I guess, I basically do the same thing, but I just let it spread out a little bit more into more of a log shape, but it's still that same act of like tucking in the ends and then pulling the bread back towards you and let it kind of like slide on the counter. So I do that until it looks how I want it. I set it in the pan, cover it with a damp towel, and let it rise until that dough has gotten a little bit over the baking pan. So you want it to rise kind of here until you can kind of see that little dome shape rise above the baking pan or the loaf pan. And then you can put it in the oven. Here I'm pulling it out, and always check your dough with a toothpick because it looks really dark on the top here, but the center was still not quite done. It was still slightly wet and sticky on my toothpick, so I knew just from past experience that about 5 more minutes, 7 minutes sometimes, back in the oven should do it. And then I'm able to finally, at the end of the day, pull the bread out of the oven. I immediately take it out of the loaf pan, and then I can easily peel off that parchment paper. I have a beautiful golden brown crust on the bottom, and I've got a darker crust on the top. If you want, you can melt butter and brush that along the top, and that makes a wonderfully soft and delicious crust. I was just feeling a little lazy today and I didn't do it, but here's how my loaf turned out. It was all so delicious, and I hope you enjoyed having a fun time with my sourdough and my starter and exactly what I made with it. And let me know down below if you make any of these recipes, or if you have a sourdough starter, what's your favorite thing to make with your sourdough. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I will see y'all next time.